Hello again. The last few days we've been looking at Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, one of the most momentous passages of the letter to the Philippians. It's one that's kind of known for. There Paul says, I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his suffering, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. We've looked at the first three things, that becoming like Christ or knowing Christ and knowing the power of Christ, the resurrection power in our life. And I talked yesterday about the fellowship that we gain with God through suffering, just as we do with other human beings. But this next one is always kind of strange to people, where he says, becoming like him in his death. And it's something that I don't know that we give a great deal of thought to. Isaiah 53 is a prophetic passage of the suffering Messiah, the suffering shepherd. And it's interesting how Isaiah described what Christ would go through, that he would go like a lamb to the slaughter. In other words, not complaining, not fighting, not resisting. He would just simply yield to what was before him. And one of the things that comes out very, very clearly in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, is that Jesus' death was not a consequence of other people's bad behavior per se. It was the fulfillment of the will of God. And Jesus said, no man takes my life from me, I give it willingly. The only way that Jesus could have been crucified was for him to allow himself to be crucified. Remember when he told Pilate, I could call 10 legions of angels? A legion of 6,000. We're talking about, the 10 times the population of the city could have showed up and wiped out the planet if they had wanted to stop this moment. But he said, it's for this very moment that I came. And so I think the first thing you really begin to see when we talk about being like him in his death is there is a yielding of ourselves to God's will regardless. It's ultimately where we say, Lord, your will be done, not my will. Your kingdom come, not my kingdom. And I find that it's interesting because there are sects within Christianity today that actually teach that your will is exactly the same as God's, and so you just need to will what you want. They call it positive confession. And your kingdom is what you should be working on because God wants you to build your kingdom, and that your relationship with God is, how good it is proportionate to how much stuff you have or how much you've acquired. And when I hear this sometimes, I think this is so diametric to the whole spirit of the gospel, that Christ came and suffered and died, and he said, we need to follow his example. He told his disciples, I've washed your feet, and you need to wash one another's feet. The whole concept was that I'm setting an example for you, and all the apostles, except for Judas, followed the example. They all suffered, as far as we know. Maybe John's an exception, but they suffered a martyr's death. And so this whole idea that if you have enough faith, you can avoid the harsh realities of life and the consequences of following Christ just seems blasphemous, quite honestly. It's blasphemous to me. And it's so contrary to the gospel, because Paul is saying, I want to become like him in his death. I want to die in the same way that he died. Not necessarily as through crucifixion. In fact, Paul was decapitated, which was the way they killed a Roman citizen. Roman citizen was never crucified. It was too shameful, too debasing. Roman citizens, if they were guilty of a capital crime, they were decapitated. Supposedly, well, it certainly was quicker and less painful in the long term, but resulted in the same consequence. You'd be in heaven immediately. But here's the thing, he says that I want to become like him. Though in the way that he walked into death, I want to live my life. I don't want to live a life of somebody who's fighting and striving. I mean, think about the thieves on the cross. The one is sitting there saying, if you're the Son of God, then save yourself and save us. That's normal. When the centurion sees Jesus die, speaking words of forgiveness, he says, surely this was the Son of God, because he'd watched many men crucified. I mean, basically, this detail of soldiers, this was their job. They crucified people. They were the expert executioners. And they weren't just some conscripts that were suddenly given a job to do that was horrendous. These guys were skilled at the art of torture and crucifixion. And they had to find some kind of pride and satisfaction in it. I would probably say they were probably pretty sociopathic in their, if not psychopathic in their behavior. So that as they're doing the most abrasive thing, I mean, when they're gambling over his garments as he is dying just feet away from him, and he says, "Father, forgive them," they don't know what they're doing. That is not the words that come out of a man who is striving to keep his life. But those are the words of a man who is giving his life for those men who don't value him at all. They don't understand what they're doing. And I think that when we look at that, we have to step back and say, how do we deal with the obstacles that we have to confront daily in our lives? I mean, do we become defensive? Do we become conflictive? Do we get out there and become pugilistic and we're fighting away to kind of hold our ground and to make sure that we don't ever get cheated or ripped off? I mean, sure, there's such a thing as prudence. There's such a thing of safety and wisdom and all of that. But there comes times when we can't control the things that are done to us. And in those moments, do we accept God's will in that? Or do we become bitter, angry people who swear vengeance one day, even though God says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord"? I think that we're under such incredible stresses and pressures in this time in our society, in American culture, that we are in such a strange cultural moment, if you will, that many of us are really struggling to find our bearings. How do we react? We see the promotion of such darkness and evil. We literally see some of the most evil things like abortion and transgender sexual abuse and all this bad behavior. And we see it promoted as being good. I mean, how in the world does somebody refer to infanticide as being a good thing? And yet that's where we are as a culture. Not completely, not totally, but I think that if more of us don't speak out more openly and regularly and honestly, people will eventually just comply and become complacent. But saying that, what was Christ like in his death? He never wavered. He had no fear. He had no hatred. He had no desire for vengeance or retribution. He didn't call people mean and nasty names. He just spoke the truth, and he did it in love. And it's so funny, it was the power of his words was in his truthfulness. And when the high priest strikes Jesus, he rebukes him for doing it, because of all people, Jesus knew that he had no right to do that was sinful. And when Pilate says, "I can save your life," Jesus said, "No, you can't. You don't have that kind of power. Only God can have that power, and I choose not to use it." So you begin to realize that there was such a difference. I don't know that we spend enough time looking at the different responses of Jesus to the world around us to understand. I mean, one of the most amazing things to me in all the gospel accounts is that Jesus chose Judas Iscariot to be an apostle, knowing who he was and what he was going to do. He knew that he was a thief. He knew that he was a liar. And he knew that even though Judas would see all the power and all the miracles, that he was so captured by selfish ambition that in the end, Judas would betray him. And Jesus knew that. And that's why at the Last Supper, we talk about the seat of honor. You know who was sitting in the seat of honor next to Jesus? It was Judas. That's why Jesus said, "Whoever I get the sop to is the one who's going to betray me." And so he puts the bread in the wine, he dips it in the sop, and he reaches over to his side to the person next to him, which is the seat of honor at the feast, and he put it in the mouth of Judas. And then he says to him, "Go do what you must do." I mean, it's an amazing thing that the person who was being honored at the very end was not somebody who was good. In fact, Peter was a little upset because he was on the opposite end of the table. He was at the far end. He was farthest away from the top, and I'm sure he felt like he deserved to be in the place of honor because, after all, he was the one who proclaimed that Jesus was the Messiah. And yet, he's put at the very bottom, and who's next to Jesus? Judas. I mean, just that realization is so astounding and so contrary and contrastive to how you and I tend to deal with life. So, you got a Judas in your life? How are you dealing with him? Are you praying for them? Are you forgiving them? Are you loving them? I'm not saying that you let them into your life where they can continue to inflict harm and difficulty on you. But I'm saying that at the same time, don't hold malice, resentment, hatred, bitterness, jealousy, and all that stuff in your heart towards that people. Pray for them all the time. I have a list of people like that in my life, and I pray for them. My wife and I pray for them every single day, because we know the only thing that can change them, the only thing that can save them is Jesus, not us. But we choose not to carry a grudge and not to seek to get even or be resentful. They belong to Jesus. They don't belong to us. They don't owe us anything, but they owe Christ everything. Well, let's continue on tomorrow as we look at the next aspect, the last part of this, going to verse 11, where he talks about attaining to the resurrection from the dead. God bless. Look forward to it. Bye-bye.